Hello and welcome to the 10th week of this online course. Today we will discuss module 22 titled as Ideological Trends in Indian Environmentalism. The broad objective of this class is to explain the ideological trends of Indian environmentalism, where we will discuss basic questions like what is ideology and what is its role in social movements, what broad range of ideological perspectives guide environmentalism and environmental movements in India, and what are the dominating ideological trends in Indian environmentalism and environmental movements. After successfully completing this module, you will be able to conceptualize ideology and its functions in collective mobilization or social movements. You will also be able to map out broad ideological trends in Indian environmentalism, and you will also spell out the differences in ideological trends in Indian environmental movements and environmentalism. In today's class, we will basically discuss three broad topics. We will begin with a discussion on conceptualizing ideology and its functions in collective mobilization or social movements. Then we will discuss about mapping the ideological trends in Indian environmentalism, and finally, we will discuss the differences in ideological trends in Indian environmentalism and environmental movements. So, let us begin with the first topic of today's class, that is conceptualizing ideology and finding the role that ideology plays in collective mobilization and social movements. Ideology play a crucial role in any collective mobilization or social movements. To understand the role of ideology in collective mobilization, let us first see how ideology is defined in social movement literature. Let us see some of the social movement scholars and see that how they have defined, how they have used ideology in the social movement framework. Rudolf Heberle, in his book Social Movements: An Introduction to Political Sociology, defines ideology as the entire complex of ideas, theories, doctrines, values and strategies and tactical principles that is characteristics of the movement. So, which means that it is the ideology which defines a movement and it characterizes the movement. Similarly, Turner and Killian in their book Collective Behavior defines ideology as prescriptions or maps that tell the individuals how to look at different people, events, and they provide a simplifying perspective through which the observer can make sense of otherwise overwhelmingly complex phenomena and find definiteness in otherwise vague and uncertain impressions. Ideologies tell the observer how to distinguish figure from the ground. Likewise, John Wilson in his book Introduction to Social Movements defines ideology as a set of beliefs about the social world and how it operates, containing statements about rightness of certain social arrangements and what actions would be undertaken in the light of those statements. Wilson writes, ideology thus serves both as a clue to understanding and as well as guiding to action. So, if you see these definitions of ideology, these ways in which ideology has been defined in the social movement literature, we may realize that ideology plays a great role in any social movement or collective mobilization. Social movements, as the name itself defines, either challenge an existing ideology or try to bring out a new ideology. The ideology provides an account of the reality and justifies and motivates an action. So, in that sense, ideology articulates and identifies mobilization's belief, goal and action. So, we need to realize that it is the ideology which helps the movement to organize, and without ideology the movement would appear as unorganized action. So, in that sense, mobilization depends upon ideology. Ideology functions two important functions or two important roles in any social movement. While on the one hand, it gives meaning and identity to the movement, because it is the ideology which defines the movement and distinguishes the participants from the non-participants. And secondly, ideology also guides the action of the movement, how the movement should mobilize its strategies, how the movement should plan its actions, the resistance and ways of protesting. All these things are guided by the ideology of the movement. Colin Beck in the book Encyclopedia of Social and Political Movements provide four perspectives of understanding ideology in any social movement. In other words, ideology can be understood in the context of social movement taking into account its 4 important roles that it plays in collective mobilization. To begin with, ideology functions as a factor for cognition, in the sense that it is through ideology which is used as a method or a toolkit to make sense of the world. In other words, the participants make sense of the movement, the participants make sense of the social reality only through the ideology. And when many people shared a common ideology, or when an ideology is shared by a collectivity or a larger collectivity, then it helps in structuring the group identity. So, in other words, it is the ideology or the ideas, when it is shared by many in a society or many in a collective mobilization, that frames or that forms the identity of the group. Say for example, we may refer those who believe in Marxist ideology as Marxism ideology as Marxist, those who care for the nature as environmentalists, similarly those who believe in Gandhian ideas as Gandhians, those who believe in feminism as feminists, or those who believe in ideas of democracy as Democrats. So, in other words, it is the ideology which provides a collective identity to the group, and because ideology is not individual, rather it is shared by many in a group or shared by many in a collective mobilization. It helps in creating group affiliation and brings together the like-minded people. In other words, ideology fulfills the role of collective mobilization. Those who shared the similar kind of ideas, those who shared the similar kind of ideologies, they construct a common identity, and it is this common identity and the ideology which brings people together in any collective mobilization. So, therefore, ideology fulfills an important role in knowing the society, in developing a cognition about the social world, because it is through an ideology that we make sense about the social world. For example, with the help of Gandhian ideology, with the help of Marxist ideology, with the help of environmental ideology, we make sense of the social world. We make sense of in the context of environmental movements, we understand how society is related to environment through certain ideologies. In the context of social movements, we understand how social reality exists with the help of certain ideologies. Secondly, ideology is not all about knowing, ideology is not all about beliefs and ideas. Ideology also emerges in the course of the movement. In other words, it is not only that ideology brings people together at some occasions or in some social movements, a movement also produces certain ideology. What I am trying to say, that while on the one hand ideology pre-exists the movement, or it brings people together to the movement, it mobilizes people for a movement. On the other hand, movement itself also produces an ideology. Movement also produces an ideology when an ideology emerges during the course of the movement out of interactions between leaders, between participants and the common public. So, therefore, ideology can also emerge during the course of the movement and can be shaped by interactions of movement participants. For example, in any revolutionary movement or in any revolutionary rebellion, where collective mobilization first challenges the dominant ideology or challenges the pre-existing ideology and rejects the existing ideology, in the due course of time or in the due course of the movement, it produces a new kind of ideology. In other words, a movement not only guided by the ideology, movement also produces an ideology. So, therefore, the second important function of ideology in the context of social movement, that a movement produces certain kind of ideology. So, similarly, in our case, any environmental movement produces certain kind of environmental ideology, produces a kind of ideology where people develop certain kind of ideas, attitudes and develop certain kind of behavior towards the nature. So, therefore, movement not only mobilizes people with the help of ideology, movement also produces a kind of ideology. The third important function of ideology in any social movement, or for that matter in environmental movement, is ideology determines action and strategy of the movement. It influences the action, strategy and the forms of mobilization. In other words, movements are framed, mobilizations are framed based on ideology. In the case of social movements, often framing the movements with the help of a particular ideology also determines mobilization. For example, when environmental movements are framed in a particular way where it is made to believe that what is at stake is the entire humanity, what is at stake is the rights of the people, then perhaps it attracts more and more people. So, therefore, in the contemporary times, when we see social movements such as human rights movements, feminist movements, environmental movements, they have been successful in gathering people, in mobilizing people from different classes, from different sections of the people, from different strata of the people. So, in other words, ideology brings people together, and the way in which a movement is framed, the way in which the movement is framed and produces a message, that to a large extent determines mobilization of the movement. If the movement produces an ideology which has a larger support, if a movement develops an ideology which is shared by many, then perhaps there is a chance that the movement will be successful. So, therefore, an ideology determines the success of the movement, because it is an ideology which gives a message, it is the ideology which determines the action, it defines the strategy, and it defines the mobilization. Finally, ideology also structures the society. In other words, ideology may be understood as the social order or as the social structure. With the help of social movements, ideologies are institutionalized within society. Ideology becomes a social order. For example, because of the communist movements or because of the socialistic movement, a new form of society is established. A communistic, a socialistic social order is established. Because of democratic movements, a democratic society is established. In other words, ideology also helps in shaping the structure of the society. It not only helps in mobilizing the movement, it also helps in structuring the society. It helps when it institutionalizes, it helps in giving a structure to the society. So, in that sense, ideology also becomes an element of social control. It becomes an element of the process of socialization. New Marxist scholars especially highlight the role of ideology in shaping the society, role of ideology in functioning as an instrument of social control. Gramsci's work on hegemony, Althusser's work on the ideological state apparatus, they all talk about how ideology plays an important role in controlling the society. In other words, what I am trying to say that in any social movement, ideology plays an important role. So, in the case of environmental movements too, ideology is important because it defines the movement. Ideology is important because it gives a meaning to the movement, and ideology is important because it distinguishes, separates participants from non-participants. It guides the action, it helps to develop a strategy and helps in large scale mobilization of the movement. And finally, ideology also gives a future direction to the movement. The kind of society that the social movement wants, the kind of social order that the social movement wants to prevail also depends upon the ideology. So, therefore, if ideology is so much relevant for a social movement, because it not only brings people together, not only helps in collective mobilization, but also helps in defining the movement as well as helps in structuring the society, then perhaps we should know what are the ideologies or what are the ideological trends that has guided, that has governed Indian environmental movements and Indian environmentalism. So, therefore, we may try to understand what are the broad ideological strands, what are the broad ideological perspectives which have guided Indian environmental movements or Indian environmental ideas. So, in the next session, let us discuss how ideology defines environmental movements in India and what are the broad ideological patterns, ideological trends or ideological perspectives in Indian environmental movements.